There are images in the history of the human soul, so simple, and yet so profound, that they pierce through every age, every culture, every heart. One of these images is the fragile moth, drawn to the flame. Welcome to my channel where we explore psychology, soul, and inner growth. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss new inspiration. Carl Jung, in his great work Symbols of Transformation, pauses on this image with extraordinary care. He reflects on a short poem, The Song of the Moth. At first glance it seems like a tiny thing. A moth sings of its longing for the flame. It speaks of its own burning, its surrender, its destruction. But Jung saw in this poem a whole universe of meaning. What is the moth? A small, delicate creature. Fragile wings, brief life, seemingly insignificant. What is the flame? Something greater, bright, consuming, irresistible. The moth is drawn to the flame, even though it knows, perhaps dimly, instinctively, that the flame will destroy it. And yet, it flies anyway. Why? Why this longing for death? Why this passion for something that consumes the very seeker? Here Jung tells us, this is not about an insect. This is about us. The moth is the human soul. The flame is the absolute mystery, the divine, the infinite, the self. The Song of the Moth is not a poem of despair. It is a hymn of longing. The moth sings, I burn in love. The burning is not suffering alone. It is fulfillment. It is ecstasy. It is union. Jung recognized in these few lines the archetype of transformation through fire. Again and again, in myths, in religions, in dreams, fire appears as the great purifier, the destroyer that also renews. The phoenix burns and rises again from its ashes. The prophet touches the coal to his lips and is purified. The alchemist places matter in the fire so that it may be transformed into gold. So too with the soul. The moth represents the ego, small, fragile, temporary. The flame represents the greater self, eternal, radiant, absolute. When the ego draws near to the self, it trembles, it suffers, it feels as though it will die. And yet, in this death, it is reborn into wholeness. Jung explains that the moth's burning is not meaningless destruction, it is initiation. The ego cannot enter union with the self unchanged. It must be burned, purified, emptied. Only then can the deeper life emerge. This is why the moth sings, not in terror, but in love. It does not fear the flame. It desires it. It longs for it. It celebrates its burning. For in that burning, it becomes one with the light. Jung points out that this image is universal in mystical traditions. The Sufis speak of the moth and the flame as the soul and the beloved. They say, the moth does not hesitate to fly into the fire, for in death it finds true life. Rumi writes, the moth's only wish is to unite with the candle, no matter if it dies. In death, it fulfills its destiny. In Christianity, too, the mystics spoke of burning love. St. John of the Cross describes the flame of divine love as a fire that wounds the soul, hurting but also healing, destroying but also perfecting. Teresa of Avila tells of the angel who pierces her heart with fire, an agony that is also bliss. Thus Jung saw the moth song as one more echo of this ancient archetype, the archetype of transformation through fire, the archetype of death and renewal, the archetype of passion that consumes, yet fulfills. But Jung also warns us, the flame is dangerous. Not every fire transforms. Some flames only destroy. The moth, in its innocence, does not distinguish. It flies blindly to the candle, as easily as to the sun. So too with the soul. We may mistake human passion, or obsession, or illusion, for the true flame of the self. And when we do, we risk being consumed without renewal. This is why Jung insists, the Song of the Moth is both an invitation and a warning. It invites us to surrender, to risk transformation, to allow the ego to be burned, in the fire of love, but it warns us to discern the true flame, the flame of wholeness, the flame of the self, and not mistake it for lesser fires that can only consume. And so, even in this small poem, Jung finds the whole story of individuation. The moth is the ego, the flame is the self, the burning is the transformation. It is death, yes, but death that leads to renewal. It is suffering, yes, but suffering that reveals joy. It is surrender, but surrender into wholeness. Thus the moth sings, and through its fragile voice, the unconscious speaks. It tells us, to live is to burn, to love is to risk death, to become whole is to be willing to surrender. When Jung turns his gaze more closely upon the song of the moth, he begins to ask, what does this burning love truly mean? At first, it appears simple. The moth is drawn to the flame, as the lover is drawn to the beloved. But Jung shows us that this image contains many layers, layers of passion, of suffering, of sacrifice, and of rebirth. The moth sings of love, but not of safe, gentle love, not of comfort, nor of security. It sings of a love so fierce that it is willing to die for it, a love that burns away the self, that consumes identity, that transforms everything in its fire. This, Jung explains, is the archetype of passion as sacrifice. The ego, fragile and limited, is offered up to something greater, and in that offering, a transformation occurs. Jung compares this with the mystical tradition. The Sufis speak of the moth and the flame as the soul and the beloved. Rumi, for instance, wrote of lovers who vanish in fire, who dissolve into the light of God. For the mystic, love is annihilation. But this annihilation is joy, because in losing the small self, the soul finds the greater self. In Christian mysticism, we see the same theme. The mystic bride longs for union with Christ, longs to be consumed in divine fire. St. John of the Cross spoke of the dark night of the soul, where the soul is purified by fire, until only love remains. Teresa of Avila described the piercing arrow of God's love, a wound that both destroys and fulfills. And so Jung points out that the moth song is part of this great mystical archetype. It is the song of passion that accepts death, the song of longing that seeks transformation, the song of the soul that desires union with the infinite, no matter the cost. But Jung does not stop at mysticism. He also looks at the psychological reality. For many people, this archetype appears not in visions of God, but in human love. The lover feels consumed, the beloved becomes the flame, and the ego, fragile, trembling, flies toward the fire, risking everything. How many poems, how many songs, how many tragedies have told this same story? Love that is ecstasy, and love that is death. Jung reminds us that this is why love is so dangerous, because love awakens the archetype of transformation. It is not only affection, it is not only pleasure, it is also fire. It threatens the ego's control. It exposes us to something greater. It can heal, or can destroy. The moth, singing of its burning, represents this paradox. The fire is death, but it is also fulfillment. The destruction is suffering, but it is also joy. The moth cannot resist the flame, just as the soul cannot resist its longing for union, whether with a human beloved or with the divine. Here Jung sees the deeper symbol, the archetype of sacrifice. Sacrifice is the offering of something precious, often life itself, to something higher. And in myth after myth, in culture after culture, we find the same truth. Creation requires sacrifice. The Norse giant Ymir, whose body became the world. The Hindu Purusha, whose sacrifice gave birth to society. Christ himself, whose crucifixion opened the way to salvation. The moth is a miniature version of this myth. It offers itself to the flame. It sings of its destruction. And in this act, it reveals the law of transformation. Life is not preserved by clinging. It is renewed by surrender. Jung insists that this archetype lives in us all. Every time we let go of an old identity, every time we die to one stage of life, in order to enter another, we are the moth flying to the flame. Every time we risk love, risk vulnerability, risk opening ourselves to the unknown, we are singing the moth song. But Jung also issues a warning. Not every fire transforms. Some flames only consume. There is a difference between the fire of transformation and the fire of mere destruction. The true flame, the one the moth longs for, is the flame of the self, the archetypal center of wholeness. If the ego mistakes another human being, or mere passion, for this absolute flame, it may be destroyed without renewal. This is the tragedy of many loves, that the ego projects the self onto the beloved, and seeks divine wholeness in another person. The result is often suffering. The beloved cannot contain the projection. The lover burns too brightly, and instead of transformation, there is collapse. But even here, Jung finds meaning, for the suffering of failed love may still awaken the soul. It may still burn away illusions. It may still force the ego to turn inward, toward the true flame of the self. Thus, the Song of the Moth is both a warning and a promise. It warns us of the danger of passion, of projecting the self onto the beloved, of seeking transcendence in another mortal. But it promises us, too, that through suffering and surrender, the soul can still be transformed. Jung's analysis reminds us that passion is never trivial. It is an archetype. It is a force of the unconscious. It is the fire of transformation, both dangerous and divine. And so the moth sings, I burn, not because it seeks destruction, but because it seeks fulfillment. Not because it longs for death, but because it longs for union. In this way, the fragile moth becomes an image of the human soul itself, small, delicate, yet filled with longing for the infinite, ready to risk everything, to fly into the mystery, to surrender to the flame, in order to be transformed. When Jung listens deeply to the Song of the Moth, he hears more than passion. He hears more than longing. He hears death. And he hears rebirth. The moth sings of burning. And burning, in its most direct meaning, is dying. The wings are consumed. The delicate body turns to ash. A small flash of light, then silence. At first glance it seems tragic, hopeless, an image of finality. And yet, Jung asks us to look again. Is this death truly an end? Or is it a passage? A doorway? A transformation into something else? In the language of myth and religion, fire almost never means extinction. It means change. It means purification. It means that the old form has died, so that a new form may appear. The moth perishes, but in its very perishing, something greater awakens. This is the great archetype of death and renewal. We see it in Egypt, in the story of Osiris, cut into pieces by his brother Set, yet reassembled and reborn as lord of the underworld. We see it in Greece, in Persephone's descent into the dark earth, and her return each spring, bringing new life to the world. We see it in Christianity, in the crucifixion of Christ, followed by the resurrection, the victory of life over death. Everywhere, across cultures, the same pattern repeats. Life dies and is renewed. The old form falls, and a new form rises. Jung tells us this pattern lives in the psyche as well. Every major transformation in life feels like a death. The end of childhood, the letting go of innocence, the painful collapse of illusions, the death of relationships, the death of identities, the death of old selves we once clung to. Each of these is a small dying, and yet, each of these deaths is also a birth, a doorway, an opening. The moth flying into the flame is a symbol of this universal law. It is destroyed, yes, but its destruction is also its fulfillment. This is why Jung connected the moth to the process of individuation. Individuation is the path by which a person becomes whole. But this wholeness is not achieved easily. It requires sacrifice. It requires endings. It requires death. The ego must die to its illusions. The persona, our mask, must fall away. The narrow self must surrender to something larger. And in this painful burning, something new emerges. The deeper self. Think of the phoenix, that legendary bird that builds its own funeral pyre, lies down, and burns to ash. At first, only destruction, only smoke and silence. But then, out of the ashes, a new bird rises, radiant, renewed, eternal. This is the same law that the moth song expresses. The fire consumes, but it also creates. It destroys, but it also renews. This is why initiation rites, across the world, so often include a symbolic death. The initiate enters darkness, a cave, a tomb, a womb. They are stripped, humbled, sometimes even buried. For a time, they are as if dead. And only then, when the old identity is gone, do they emerge into light, reborn, renewed, transformed. The moth, trembling and small, follows this same path. It flies into the flame, and in that death, it joins the eternal light. But what does this mean for us? In our everyday lives? Jung explains, every crisis, every loss, every painful ending we endure, is a kind of burning. When we lose a relationship, when we lose a dream, when we lose a vision of who we thought we were, it feels like death. And it is death. The death of an old self. The death of an old world. But if we endure it, if we let the fire do its work, then from the ashes, a new life begins. This is why Jung often said, the unconscious speaks in paradox. The moth's burning is death, and it is also life. It is suffering, and it is also bliss. It is destruction, and it is also fulfillment. The psyche, in its deepest layers, does not separate opposites. It unites them. And in symbols like the moth, we are shown that truth. Consider our dreams. Dreams of falling. Dreams of being devoured. Dreams of fire. At first, we fear them. They feel like nightmares. They feel like the psyche is trying to kill us. But Jung says, often these dreams are not about death as finality. They are about transformation. The old form dying. The new form waiting to be born. The moth sings the same. Its burning is terrible, and yet it is sacred. We see this pattern also in nature itself. The seed must split open and die as a seed. In order to become a tree, the caterpillar must dissolve inside the chrysalis, a complete breakdown of its body, before the butterfly can emerge. In each case, death is not the end. It is the condition for transformation. The moth is simply another version of this eternal rhythm. And so Jung teaches us, when we face endings, when we feel ourselves burning, we must remember, it is not only death, it is also rebirth. It is also transformation. It is also renewal. This is why the moth sings, not with fear, but with joy. It knows it will perish. And yet, in perishing, it is fulfilled. The flame takes its small life and joins it to the great life. The death is union. The destruction is transcendence. The moth becomes eternal in the very moment of its ending. And so, when we hear this fragile song, we should hear it also as our own. For each of us is the moth. Each of us must fly into flames of loss, flames of suffering, flames of transformation. Each of us must allow something in us to die. An illusion, a false self, an old life, so that something new may be born. This is not easy. It hurts. It feels like annihilation. But the moth reminds us, the flame is not only death, it is also light. It is also life. Thus, the song of the moth is a hymn to the eternal rhythm of existence. Life dies. Life is reborn. The cycle continues. And within this rhythm, we too are carried. Our endings are not the end. Our deaths, both great and small, are thresholds. They are passages into something greater. This is why Jung finds the moth so meaningful. Because in this tiny creature, singing of its burning, the unconscious reveals the greatest truth of all, that death and life are not opposites. They are one. They are two sides of the same flame. And to live deeply is to accept this mystery. To live fully is to fly willingly into the fire. To become whole is to allow ourselves to burn, and to trust that from the ashes, we will rise again. When we listen again to the song of the moth, we hear not only death, not only renewal, we hear love, we hear passion, we hear the cry of a soul, willing to risk everything for union with the flame. The moth does not hesitate. It knows the danger. It senses the end. And yet, it flies. Why? Because love is stronger than fear. Because passion is stronger than survival. Because union with the flame is worth more than life itself. This, Jung tells us, is the archetype of love as sacrifice. Not the gentle love of comfort, but the burning love of surrender. A love that says, I would rather perish in fire than remain safe in darkness. A love that transforms because it consumes. The moth song is not unique. It is a fragment of a universal chorus. Across ages and cultures, mystics and poets have sung of the same longing. In Sufi mysticism, the moth and the flame are ancient symbols. The soul is the moth. The beloved God is the flame. The moth flies willingly to its end. And in death, it finds eternal life. Rumi writes of this love, a love so fierce that it destroys the lover's small self, and yet fulfills the soul's deepest desire. In Christianity, too, we hear this song. The mystic longs for the fire of divine love. The soul is the bride, and Christ is the bridegroom. St. John of the Cross describes the living flame of love, that wounds and heals, that burns and perfects. Teresa of Avila tells of the angel's arrow of fire, a piercing agony, that is also bliss. Jung shows us that all these voices speak of the same archetype, the archetype of passion as burning, the archetype of love as sacrifice, the archetype of transformation through the fire of desire. But what about human love? What about the everyday passions of men and women? Jung reminds us, the same archetype lives there too. When we fall in love, we feel consumed. The beloved becomes the flame. The ego trembles, and the soul risks everything. Think of how many poems, songs, tragedies have told this story. Romeo and Juliet, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere. Love that defies reason. Love that courts death. Love that destroys, and yet feels eternal. Jung says, this is no accident. This is the unconscious at work. Because love awakens the deepest forces in the psyche. It is not only emotion. It is archetype. It is fire. It threatens the ego's control. It overwhelms the rational mind. It opens us to something greater. This is why love feels divine. Because in it, we sense the self. The beloved becomes a vessel for the archetype. We see eternity in their eyes. We feel infinity in their presence. But this is also dangerous, because no human being can contain the entire self. No mortal can be the flame of eternity. And so projection happens. We place the image of the divine onto the beloved. We mistake them for the flame itself. And when they fail to contain it, when they fall short, as mortals always do, we feel betrayed. We feel shattered. We feel as though love has burned us to ash. Jung warns us of this danger. The moth's passion is archetypal, but if we attach it blindly to another person, we risk destruction without renewal. The true flame is the self. Only there can the burning become transformation. Yet even failed love, Jung says, can awaken the soul. Even in disappointment, the fire burns away illusions. Even in heartbreak, something deeper is revealed. The ashes may still contain the seed of new life. And so love is never trivial. It is always archetypal. It is always fire. It can heal. It can destroy. But it always transforms. The moth sings of this love. Not a safe love, not a comfortable love, but a love that consumes. A love that risks death. A love that fulfills through surrender. This, Jung explains, is why passion is so feared and so desired, because it threatens the ego. It strips us bare. It demands that we give ourselves up, but in doing so, it opens us to the self. It brings us closer to wholeness. The archetype of eternal burning appears again and again, in myth, in poetry, in religion, in our own lives. It tells us, to love is to burn, to desire is to risk, to surrender is to transform. But Jung also asks, what if the flame is not outside us? What if the flame is within? The self, he says, is the true light, and when the ego approaches it, it feels like death. It feels like burning. But it is not destruction. It is initiation. The Moth song, then, is the song of the soul, approaching its own center. This is why mystics describe union with God in terms of love, because psychologically, union with the self feels the same. It is longing. It is passion. It is fire. It is surrender. And though the ego resists, the soul sings, I burn, I burn. Thus the moth's fragile voice becomes our own. In every passion, in every love, in every surrender, we hear it. We too are drawn to the flame. We too risk ourselves. We too long to be consumed, so that we may be transformed. And so the Song of the Moth is more than a poem. It is a mirror of the soul. It is the archetype of eternal burning. It is the hymn of passion as transformation. It reminds us that love is not safe, that passion is not easy, that surrender is not painless. But it is through this fire that the soul becomes whole. The moth sings, and through its song, the unconscious speaks. It tells us, to live is to love is to burn, and to burn is to be transformed. When Jung reflects on the Song of the Moth, he tells us, this is not only poetry, this is psychology. The moth is not only an insect, it is the human ego. It is consciousness itself, fragile, uncertain, trembling. And the flame is not only fire, it is the self. It is the wholeness of the psyche. It is the eternal center, larger than the ego can ever imagine. The ego approaches the flame and feels fear. It feels danger. It feels death. Because the ego knows, if it comes too close, it will be consumed. But the soul knows something deeper. It knows that in the burning, there is also transformation. This is why Jung often spoke of individuation as a path of fire. To individuate is not to grow comfortably. It is not to remain as we are. It is to be broken. It is to burn. It is to let go of illusions, masks, false selves. And in this painful process, something greater is born. The moth's burning is the ego's surrender. The ego resists. It wants to survive. It wants to stay in control. But individuation requires surrender. It requires that the ego give itself up to the deeper self. And in that surrender, transformation happens. But what exactly is the self? Jung describes it as the totality of the psyche. It includes both conscious and unconscious, both light and shadow, both what we know and what we cannot know. The self is the center of wholeness, and when the ego comes near it, it feels as though it is approaching God. This is why the moth sings of the flame as love, because psychologically, union with the self feels like passion. It feels like fire. It feels like dying, and yet like bliss. But there is another layer here. The flame is not only light, it is also shadow. Jung reminds us, the self contains all opposites, good and evil, creation and destruction, life and death. When the ego approaches it, it cannot choose only the light. It must also face the darkness. This is the encounter with the shadow. The shadow is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. Everything we deny, repress, hide. Our anger, our greed, our fear, our weakness, our unlived potential. All of it waits in the unconscious. All of it burns like hidden fire. To approach the flame, the ego must face the shadow. This is why individuation is so difficult. It is not only light. It is also confrontation. It is also suffering. It is also a painful honesty about who we truly are. The moth's burning, then, is also this confrontation. The wings catch fire. The body is scorched. The ego suffers. Because to be whole, it must integrate even the darkness. But Jung also says, the shadow is not only negative. It is also energy. It is also life. It is also everything we need to become complete. If we dare to enter it, if we dare to burn, we discover gifts hidden in the fire. This is individuation, not the denial of shadow, but its integration. The moth does not escape the flame. It does not turn away. It flies directly into it and is transformed. Think of our own lives. Every time we face a painful truth about ourselves, every time we admit what we have denied, every time we confront our shadow, we feel as though we are burning. The ego resists. It wants to stay intact. It does not want to be scorched. But if we endure it, if we allow ourselves to burn, we are changed. We are deepened. We are made whole. The moth song is the song of individuation. It whispers, you must fly into the fire. You must let yourself burn. You must allow the ego to die, so that the self may live. This is why Jung compared individuation to an initiation ritual. The ego is tested. It is stripped, humbled, broken. It descends into darkness. It feels like death. But this death is the doorway to transformation. The moth knows this. It sings of its own burning with joy, because in that burning, it is not destroyed. It is made whole. There is another image Jung uses. He says, to encounter the self is to encounter the divine. The ego cannot fully grasp it. It is too great. It is too vast. It feels overwhelming. And so the ego trembles. It feels as though it will be annihilated. But in truth, the flame is the very source of life. What seems like death to the ego is life to the soul. And so the moth's burning is also worship. It is sacrifice. It is offering. The ego gives itself up to the greater wholeness. And in that offering, it is fulfilled. This is the deep psychology of the image. Not destruction, but transformation. Not despair, but initiation. And yet, Jung warns us again. The fire must be the true flame. If we mistake obsession, or addiction, or projection, for the self, we may be consumed. Without renewal, the moth flying into a false flame dies in vain. So too with us. We must discern the true fire, the flame of the self, if our burning is to become wholeness. This is why dreams, myths, and symbols are so important. They guide us. They help us recognize the true flame. They reveal the difference between destructive fire and transformative fire. The moth song is one of those guides. It reminds us, the flame that consumes and renews is the flame of the self. Thus, the song of the moth is not only about love. It is not only about passion. It is about psychology itself. It is about the drama of ego and self, of consciousness and unconsciousness, of shadow and light. It is the story of individuation. And so when we hear this song, fragile, trembling, we should hear it also as our own. For each of us is the moth. Each of us is fragile ego. Each of us is drawn to the flame. We may resist. We may fear. But deep down, we long to burn. Because deep down, we know that only in burning do we become whole. The moth sings, and through it, the unconscious speaks. It tells us, to live is to risk is to burn is to transform, and transformation is the path to wholeness. And so we come to the end of the Song of the Moth, a tiny poem, a fragile image, a delicate creature, drawn to the flame. And yet, within this small picture, Jung discovered an entire universe. What did he see? He saw the archetype of passion, the archetype of sacrifice, the archetype of death and renewal, the archetype of individuation itself. The moth sings, and through its fragile voice, the unconscious speaks. It tells us, to love is to risk, to desire is to surrender is to burn, and to burn is to be transformed. This is the story of the moth, and this is the story of the soul. Think of the journey we have taken. First, the moth sang of longing, of its desire for the flame, a desire so powerful that it was willing to risk death. Then the moth sang of burning, its fragile wings consumed, its body offered to the fire, and yet its voice joyful, because in destruction, it found union. Then we heard the deeper meaning. That burning is not only death, it is transformation, it is renewal, it is the eternal law of life. And finally, Jung shows us, the moth is the ego, the flame is the self, the burning is individuation. This small poem is a map of the human soul. But what does this mean for us today? For the modern person, living in a world of technology, noise, distraction, why should we listen to the song of a moth? Because the archetype is still alive. We still long. We still love. We still burn. Every passion we feel, every love we risk, every transformation we undergo, all of these are the moth's song, echoing through our own lives. Jung reminds us, the unconscious is timeless. Its symbols never die. And so, when we hear the moth, we are hearing ourselves. Consider our modern loves. How often do we project eternity onto another person? How often do we burn with passion that feels divine? How often do we risk everything for love, for desire, for longing? This is the moth. This is the flame. This is the same archetype, repeating in our hearts. Consider our modern crises. How often do we lose our way? How often do we feel consumed by fire, by failure, by heartbreak, by endings we did not choose? This too is the moth. This too is burning. And this too can be transformation, if we endure it, if we trust the flame, and consider our own inner journeys. How often do we encounter the shadow? How often do we face truths we would rather not see? Each time, the ego feels as though it is burning. Each time, we feel as though we are dying. But Jung says, this is individuation. This is the path to wholeness. This is the moth flying to the flame. So the message is clear. The moth song is not just about death. It is about life. It is about love. It is about the eternal rhythm of destruction and renewal. It is about the soul's deepest journey, the journey toward the self. And perhaps this is why the moth sings with joy. It does not fear the flame. It does not lament its burning. It celebrates. It surrenders. It loves. Because it knows, in the fire, it is fulfilled. This is the final paradox. To the ego, the flame looks like death. But to the soul, the flame is eternity. To the ego, burning looks like annihilation. But to the soul, burning is union. To the ego, fire looks like the end. But to the soul, fire is the beginning. And so Jung leaves us with this vision. A fragile moth, a dangerous flame, a song of burning, and within it, the entire mystery of the psyche. For us as modern seekers, the challenge is the same. Will we dare to love? Will we dare to risk? Will we dare to surrender? Will we dare to fly into the flame? It is not easy. It never was. The fire can hurt. The fire can destroy. But the fire can also transform. It can purify. It can renew. It can make us whole. And so the song of the moth becomes our own song. The song of every soul that longs for more than survival. The song of every heart that dares to love beyond fear. The song of every seeker who risks the fire of transformation. Jung tells us, this is individuation. This is life itself. To live fully is to burn. To love deeply is to risk death. To surrender is to be transformed. And to be transformed is to become whole. So when you hear the moth's fragile voice, do not dismiss it. Do not think it is only poetry. Listen closely. Listen with your heart. Because it is also your voice. It is also your story. It is the story of longing, the story of burning, the story of becoming. The moth sings, and through its song, the unconscious speaks to us all. It tells us, do not fear the fire. Do not cling to the dark. Fly, surrender, burn, and in burning, become whole. And so we close the journey of the moth, a fragile creature, a dangerous flame, a song of burning, and a vision of transformation. If this story touched something in you, if you felt the fire, if you recognized your own longing in the song of the moth, then I invite you to stay on this path with me. Please like this video. If the message spoke to your heart, share your reflections in the comments. What does the moth song mean to you? What flames have you dared to approach in your own life? And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next deep journey into Jungian psychology, archetypes, and the mysteries of the unconscious. Thank you for walking this path with me. Thank you for listening to the Song of the Moth. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, and let your soul keep singing.